Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. I was asked at this conference to talk about mid-century modernism in Southern California, and more specifically, the influence Michigan might have had on the region's contributions to design during that period. Looking at other session topics, I noticed that this question wasn't asked of any other region in the US, and it seemed to be a sign, probably overinterpreted by myself, that LA is now widely accepted as a key center for modern innovation, particularly probably in residential design. So if we want to look at where Michigan-born or educated modernists played a key role outside of the state, then LA would be an important place to consider. Even more interesting, we might find a rich exchange between practitioners in both places. Michiganians, is that right? Michiganians? Michiganders didn't just come to California, but California sometimes also came to Michigan. Of course, everybody here would know the List House, and on the right-hand side, a Richard Neutra house from about the same time period in my own neighborhood in Silver Lake in Los Angeles. While Southern California is currently recognized for its wealth of avant-garde mid-century design, this wasn't always the case. Starting in the early 20th century, Southern California-based architects struggled to make their work more visible in an architecture climate where innovation was thought to move from Europe to the East Coast, skip to Chicago, over Michigan, and rarely move out over the Rockies to LA. In recent years, the Michigan State Historic Preservation Office, in concert with local institutions like Kendall, of course, has worked to change this reductive narrative. Their efforts have been widely recognized by professional architecture and design organizations, such as the Society of Architectural Historians, which is where I sort of live sometimes as a historian, which held their 2012 meeting in Detroit. My California colleagues were highly influenced by that conference, and they traveled back home inspired to learn more about Michigan's contributions in our own state. That conversation is still ongoing with all of my colleagues. For example, LA-based scholars like Alan Hess, who's a friend of mine, are now pointing out just how broad this influence was. And he states, within this framework of modern innovation and broad cultural understanding, Michigan's auto stylists, furniture designers, and architects hammered out the aesthetic issues of mass production versus handcraft, of democratized consumer products versus fine art design, of the spirit of tradition versus a spirit of innovation. In Michigan, Hess concludes, importantly, modern theory was derived from practice, not vice versa. Such ideas would be picked up later in the century in Southern California and then eventually in Silicon Valley. What I find intriguing and what I want to talk about today is the process by which a region that might not otherwise be recognized nationally for their central role in modernism, read by Europe or the East Coast of the US, succeeds in finally garnering that recognition. My own research in this regard has been focused on Southern California and Esther McCoy, who you see here on your left, a writer and architectural critic who worked hard to bring the contributions of Southern California's architectural avant-garde to international attention. She did this through an extremely prolific career that included articles for over a dozen publications, and pioneering books like Five California Architects, which is perhaps her best known, but not her only. With the help of Julius Schulman's photographs, the photograph being so important, of course, we learned this week, she reached a broad audience with her pithy articles in the Los Angeles Times Home magazine, and a more selective but crucial audience that we'll talk about today with her articles in journals like Arts and Architecture, which went primarily to an architecture-based crowd. While I don't discuss it today, the photograph is key here. In my other life, I direct the Julius Schulman Institute, which is very focused on the architectural photograph. Schulman often accompanied Esther McCoy on her trips out into the architecture world, her assignments, Esther McCoy getting the assignments, and then getting Julius to come along with her. And his images have been instrumental in creating a mythology surrounding the California lifestyle, a sort of graceful informality where lush gardens meet factory prefab buildings, and the adults, of course, are always lounging around. McCoy's efforts to establish Southern California architecture and its residential architecture in particular as part of the architectural canon was a deliberate project and a successful one. At its base was a desire to paint a picture of architectural inventiveness that was meant to be read as both specific to the region, but also indicative of Los Angeles' rightful place in a broader pantheon of great centers of modern design. What it also succeeded in doing, and I'm not sure if this was her intention or not, was to claim its practitioners as products of the California environment. This sort of homegrown characterization was useful to her mission, but obscured the fact that most Angelenos were born and sometimes educated elsewhere, including, and of course of most interest to us, in Michigan. Perhaps three of the most important people in this regard were John Intenza, the Michigan-born editor of Arts and Architecture magazine, and Charles and Ray Eames, who we know well here, designers who had met at Cranbrook in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, and whose work was largely promoted by Intenza's journal. While the general contributions of Arts and Architecture magazine and the Eameses are well known, historicizing projects like McCoy's have helped to obscure their connection to Michigan, particularly if you're coming from the California point of view, probably not from the Michigan point of view. This conference has provided me with an opportunity to introduce you to McCoy's project, if you didn't know it, and then to take apart her California-centric narrative through the example of Intenza and the Eameses. These pictures, by the way, are images that made Schulman and Los Angeles, by extension, very famous. Intenza never would have included these in Arts and Architecture magazine. This whole lifestyle image in the Technicolor was not his thing. Him and Schulman used to fight voraciously about it. Two very difficult personalities. Esther McCoy is an LA icon in the architecture world, but even her roots can be traced to the Midwest. Raised in Coffeyville, Kansas, as a teenager she found Midwestern life prosaic, but her family's voracious and diverse reading habits, which she later recalled in this 1958 LA Times article, Family Reading, shaped her propensity for strong opinions and a healthy argument about ideas. Although McCoy's career was eventually defined by her contribution to architectural criticism, she identified herself first and foremost as a writer in the most traditional sense. She pursued a degree in literature at a few colleges, bouncing around for a bit, but completed her bachelor's from the University of Michigan in 1925, a fact that I was delighted to recall when asked to speak at this conference. I admittedly had forgotten that, went back into the archives, and it came back to mind. And in fact, this final stage of her formal education, I had remembered, was actually an important factor in the context of McCoy's life. My research on McCoy began with a collection of her early diaries, many entries of which were written as a student while at the University of Michigan, which was a little bit more forward-thinking than some of the other universities in the country at the time. And it was there that she was first taken seriously as a thinking woman who was in college to do more than find a husband, which is a bit of a rarity at the time. Reading her personal writings was a riveting experience for me and a young woman's passionate discovery of modern literature and a rejection of mainstream morality. If you ever read somebody's early diaries, it's a very bizarre experience to read something that's so personal. But I really think it was clear that she put them at the front of all of these boxes that are at the Smithsonian, which she organized herself and bequeathed herself in 1989 before she died. So scholars like me would come and obtain this very specific understanding of her burgeoning interest in leftist politics and experimental literature. These interests were later fostered through an early identification with the cultural and political spirit of New York's Greenwich Village, where she lived between 1926 and 1937. For much of this time, she resided in Greenwich Village itself on the famous Patchen Place. This is my photo of it over here, which is this gated cul-de-sac that has these three-story walk-ups. And it housed a literary enclave. A lot of people who wrote lived there, including E.E. Cummings and a few others. The small community defined Prohibition-era Bohemia, thriving off its respect for the communal support of fellow artists, radical politics, and the maintenance of one of the village's most notorious speakeasies. McCoy felt she had found her spiritual home here, and she settled into Bohemian life. She thought she would spend the rest of her life there in the village. But lucky for LA, the fates had other plans. She contracted a stubborn pneumonia, And like so many others before her, took a work opportunity to come to Los Angeles to see if the climate could cure her. I actually think she came to LA working for Theodore Dreiser. She was his assistant for a long time. And I believe he was working on some noir fiction short stories. And of course, LA was the center of noir at the time, so I think she was out there researching. There she met John and Tenza. This is a later photograph of them. I could not find an earlier photograph in her files, and John and Tenza's files are a little bit elusive. Neither one was involved with architecture when they met. This would come later. They bonded instead, and ironically, over their mutual dislike for LA. As McCoy remembered many years later, this is her, "We met at a time when Los Angeles was the wrong place to be. San Francisco was all right, but in 1932, LA, even Santa Monica, was déclassé. John Atenza was in his late 20s, had a great dignity and an outrageous sense of humor. We started quarreling at once and then howled with laughter at his instructions to an ant pushing a crumb across the table. That was the key to our friendship, that and the fact that we were trying to escape from Los Angeles, but 30 years later, we were both still here." In some ways, their lives were parallel. And Tenza was born in 1903, just a year earlier than McCoy, in Calumet, Michigan, all the way at the north of the state, right? His mother was a wealthy mining heiress, but his father was an attorney involved with migrant and veterans workers issues. And I wonder if this more radical side of his upbringing brought them together, although I secretly suspect it had more to do with their mutual sharp tongues and love for a good piece of architectural gossip. And Tenza found his way to LA in the early 1930s and began working for an experimental film production unit through MGM. He had a passing interest in architecture at the time, but it was augmented when his father's business partner commissioned but didn't complete a house by Harwell Hamilton Harris, the business partner being a woman, which I think has an interesting story behind it that I haven't quite unearthed yet. In what might have been his first role as patron of architecture, in 1937, Intenza commissioned Harris to build him a home, albeit one that looked much different than Harris's signature wood, post, and beam style of the time. 50 years later, McCoy still found it significant enough, or at least her friendship with Intenza close enough, to include it in her book, The Second Generation. You see both pictured here. In 1938, he began working at California Arts and Architecture, a magazine that Barbara Goldstein has called a staid provincial publication focusing on local residential architecture and gardening. And you see a cover from 1929 of the old California Arts and Architecture. And Tenza eventually purchased the magazine, and in 1944, in a move that signaled a more cosmopolitan ambition, dropped the California from the title and began publishing and editing it himself for about 20 years, actually. And during this time, the philosophy behind the newly titled Arts and Architecture was inclusive, covering architects from across the country and all aspects of modern avant-garde culture, from painting to music to textile design. It also had a strong social agenda. And Tenza used his editorial column, it was called Notes in Passing, to comment on race relations, human rights, and childcare. And these were all interests that he had derived from his father during his early days in Michigan as a young boy. Most of all, he promoted young architects and designers, and in so doing, McCoy would later state, helped to provide a forward-thinking counter to the conservative tendency and housing styles after the war. LA, of course, being a huge center for housing production after the war, a lot of it sort of, Levittown-oriented, Lakewood being the largest development of this kind in LA. McCoy's journey to architecture also took a circuitous route. By 1938, she had moved to Los Angeles permanently, and during the war, took a job working as a draftsperson for Douglas Aircraft. That's her dressed for work on the right-hand side. She enjoyed the work, and after the war, considered applying for architecture school at the University of Southern California. But as with many women at the time, the school's administrators discouraged her based on her age and her sex. I think it's sort of hilarious now that they actually give out an Esther McCoy Award at USC. rolling over in her grave. She enjoyed the work, and after the war, after the war, considered applying, when her friend Pauline Schindler encouraged her to apply for an opening in her ex-husband Rudolf Schindler's office, McCoy took the opportunity. She thought this was the one opportunity. She can't go to architecture school. Maybe she can work in an architecture office. And she jumped at the chance and delivered her resume. A little, if you don't know the sort of funny story, Pauline and Schindler were divorced at the time. RM and Pauline were divorced, but they were still sharing the same house that RM had built for them and another couple. These are just some famous photographs of the house. Pauline was in one wing, Schindler was in the other, and he had built a big barrier between the two. So Esther had to walk out of Pauline's side, down to the street, around the corner, and knock on Schindler's door to give him her resume. McCoy's 1945 article, Schindler, Space Architect, was her first on Southern California architecture, written during her first year working in Schindler's studio. She was 41 years old when she started this. Published in the journal Direction, she wrote the article as a response to frequent requests for information about the architect's work. Schindler was rarely preoccupied with self-promotion, and like most architects practicing in the region, with the exception of Neutra, Richard Neutra, who's published widely in Europe at the time, and was promoted, of course, through the 1932 International Style Exhibition in New York City. Very few people knew about Schindler or a lot of the other architects in Southern California. On the surface, the article is a story of McCoy's own tutorial in architecture while working in Schindler's office. It begins, one day, Schindler was looking at the floor plan of a house, and goes on to describe why he designs and builds in terms of space forms rather than mass forms. The article is illustrated with a photograph of the 1937 Radikowitz house by Julius Schulman, but her description could apply to any of Schindler's hillside homes, such as the Wolf House, which is pictured over here on the right-hand side, and featured in an article by McCoy in Intensa's Arts and Architecture magazine. As Schindler House is in movement, it is becoming. Form emerges from form, she states, describing the volumes of the house as they step down with the earth and the easy movement between garden and living room through these large sliding glass doors. The descriptive language is clearly her own, but the grasp of the technique of designing in these three dimensions and piecing together the different spatial units into a single volume derives directly from conversations that she was having with Schindler while her time working in the office. He'd written articles about this, and of course he was influenced by Adolf Loos in Austria. McCoy adopts the identity of pupil in this first article, but she also confidently steps into the role of advocate. At its base, the article is a direct response to the lack of recognition surrounding LA modernism generally, and Schindler's work particularly. It also begins to identify West Coast modernism with the local ecology, an association that we now take for granted, but with which we had yet to be established as a guiding principle of design at the time. At least it was just starting to come out in the press. As McCoy rhapsodizes in that first article, who else had that respect for the land, its moods and dignity? Who else had let the land dictate the house rather than imposing the house on the land? Frank Lloyd Wright, yes. Who else? Very few. There was but a small group, most of them living in California, proving ground of all that was new in architecture. You can see this sort of language start to come out. McCoy's article came out the same year John Intensa launched the Case Study House program in arts and architecture. His project promoted the work of LA's avant-garde on local sites and quickly became synonymous with the region's modernist identity. It also put LA on the architectural map, enticing young architects from around the world to ditch Italy for Los Angeles on their grand tours. This was a big thing. In this climate, McCoy's article is a significant early contribution, particularly because it states clearly that local conditions are important for understanding the Southern California architect's work. In fact, she addresses it directly in this first writing on Schindler. While sifting through Schindler's files one day, she writes, she ran across a letter from a prominent modern, someone who had made it into that 1932 International Style exhibition. And the person who was importing sort of the style from Europe to the East Coast. And it said in his letter to Schindler, "Your attitude towards architecture is undoubtedly colored by life in California." And it was supposed to be meant as sort of condescending. To McCoy, this is an amazing thing for an architect to say. How could not the life of an architect be colored by his surroundings? About Schindler, she states, "He dug into the place where he had settled. He knew its temperatures and winds and all of its caprices." As Thoreau once said of Concord, Schindler had traveled far in Los Angeles. The article ends with the now canonical photograph of Edward Weston of Schindler in profile, his chin slightly lifted, eyes squinting in the California sunshine. It is an eloquent first exercise, I think, in pairing prose with image in order to advance her new cause. McCoy's chief contribution to California modernism is often attributed to her 1960 book, Five California Architects. But the content for these chapters was largely published before the book came out, mainly in arts and architecture, and probably less known for the Los Angeles Times Home magazine. And this is an article about Gregory Ain called What I Believe. She did a series of articles called What I Believe, which was these sort of announcements of each of these architects that she wanted to promote, and she did them in the magazine. The house here is his cooperative housing, the Avenel Homes, and I believe he was actually working on this design while he was an engineer in the Eames's office where he was working at the time. McCoy used the Home magazine as a venue for tackling key controversial topics surrounding modern design and encouraging acceptance of experimental architects by her readers through her personable yet educational prose. These readers were not only women and Angelenos. The Home magazine had a broad subscribership, and McCoy, almost always in collaboration with Julius Schulman, sometimes later with Marvin Rand, who is a photographer that has yet to be fully unearthed, introduced them to Southern California's architectural avant-garde. For Arts and Architecture, she was able to publish longer articles discussing the work of architects that she wrote about in the LA Times and later published in Five California Architects. In Barbara Goldstein's introduction to her book about Intenza's years directing the magazine, she describes how McCoy and Intenza formed a powerful team. Her taut writing complemented the modernism of the magazine, and Intenza trusted her eye and judgment. And despite both of their connections to the Midwest, it was the California scene that they were both wanting and working to publicize primarily. It was in these articles that McCoy's theory that forms sprang up naturally from the California soil was its most direct. For example, McCoy published foundational modernist works by architects like Charles and Henry Green and Arts and Architecture under titles like Roots of California Contemporary Architecture. Not the title I show you here, but the reproduction of that particular article was so bad, I reached and found another one from Arts and Architecture. And she had these titles despite the fact that the architects were raised and educated in St. Louis and Boston. In this context, the houses pictured were meant to be reinterpreted as indebted to European arts and crafts via Gustav Stickley, as seen, for example, in the Mission furniture designed in Grand Rapids that Christian talked about yesterday, and more to Pasadena's balmy evenings enjoyed on sleeping porches, the melding of the home with the terrain expressed in the sort of arroyo rock foundation to the home, and LA's early and prolonged connection to Japanese building traditions, which we see, of course, in the roofing technique and a lot of the joinery. When taken together, McCoy's articles in Intenza's magazine and elsewhere survey the key elements we now associate with Southern California modernism: a sensitivity to hilly sites in a warm climate, casual indoor-outdoor living, an indebtedness to Japanese construction principles, and experimentation in materials, particularly the plywood, steel, and aluminum produced in LA's wartime aviation factories during the war. We'll talk about this in a minute. The role experimental materials and construction techniques would play in housing after the war was of particular interest to Intenza and was the most frequent subject for discussion in the pages of Arts and Architecture. How would California respond to the war? McCoy was keenly aware of these discussions, having worked at Douglas Aircraft, of course, and then briefly pursuing that career in architecture, which really only lasted a year or two. She was an ardent supporter and documenter of the Case Study House program, putting out her own book in 1962, the year that Intenza moves back to the Midwest, this time to Chicago. And I believe the Case Study House program in this sense is probably Intenza's greatest legacy. It's what we know him for. And it was also the framework within which we can unpack some of McCoy's historicizing, even perhaps mythologizing of design in the region. It also illuminates some significant intersections between Michigan and California beyond Intenza himself. In January 1945, Intenza, who I think should be noted had a way with words himself, introduced the theory behind the Case Study House program. He says, because most opinion, both profound and light-headed, in terms of post-war housing, is nothing but speculation in the form of talk and reams of paper. It occurs to us that it might be a good idea to get down to cases and at least make a beginning in the gathering of that mass of materials that must eventually result in what we know as house post-war. With that auspicious beginning, they introduced 8 designs by established architects like Richard Neutra and J.R. Davidson, as well as several of the new generation that included Eero Saarinen, Charles Eames, and Ralph Rapson. There was a tight group of friendship here. There's a little circle of people who hung out, you'll see. In the tradition of the magazine thus far, architects worked with manufacturers of materials and appliances. But Intenza assured the readership that no attempt will be made to use a material merely because it is new or tricky. Practicality lay at the heart of the project, houses designed with real clients in mind on real sites in Southern California. You can see an ad here that ran at the same time of the announcement of the Case Study House program. So already he's linking in advertising with design within the magazine. Not funding the magazine that well, by the way. It was really a labor of love for Intenza. The Case Study House program is indelibly tied to architects we often consider quintessentially Californian. But here Intenza's working and personal connections stand out. Sumner Spalding and John Rex were selected to build Case Study House number 2. Spalding, who was born in Ionia, Michigan, and went to the University of Michigan for a few years, served as a regular member of the magazine's advisory team and helped run its 1943 Design for Post-War Living competition. Ralph Rapson, who was based in Minnesota for much of his career, obtained his architecture degree at the University of Michigan and later obtained a scholarship to Cranbrook. There, he met and worked with Charles and Ray Eames and spent time as a young architect in Eliel Saarinen's office. He was selected to design Case Study House number 4, deemed the Greenbelt House. You probably remember the famous drawing with the helicopter overhead, and despite there being a helicopter in the picture, a woman is hanging laundry on a clothesline. McCoy will make fun of this. She's very much in tune with the woman's role in the home. So we have helicopters, but we don't have washers and dryers. She'll tease Ralph Rapson about this. So he's selected to design the Greenbelt House. Perhaps most significant, however, was Intenza's relationship with Charles and Ray Eames, which was short and tumultuous and ended in the early 1950s. Michigan is of central importance to the story of American design for many reasons, but we don't always pause to give it credit for igniting significant love affairs. Without Cranbrook, we'd have no Charles and Ray Eames, a partnership that helped define the modern husband-wife architecture office so common today, and bring universal design principles into fashion. As a brand, the Eameses are inseparable from LA's freewheeling architecture climate in the popular imagination. But they met in 1940 while Charles was an instructor and Ray a student at Cranbrook Academy of Art, which was still arts and craft oriented under Eliel Saarinen's directorship. At the time, Charles was still married to his first wife, Scandal, but he fell hard for Ray and married her soon after divorcing. The letter here written just at that point, "Dear Miss Kaiser," Ray's maiden name is Kaiser, I am 34, almost years old, single again, and broke. I love you very much and would like to marry you very, very soon. I cannot promise to support us very well, but if given the chance, we're sure and hell try. Drawing of her finger, of course, with the ring. Love, XXXXXXX, Charlie. In addition to classmates Ralph Rapson and Harry Bertoia, Bertoia would later work in the Eames's furniture studio in Los Angeles. They also, of course, met Eero Saarinen at Cranbrook. The younger Saarinen was serving as a student apprentice for his father, Eliel. Charles and Saarinen began developing plywood furniture, which is well known. What's less well known is this was with Ray's help. She did a lot of the drawing. And while the furniture was a critical success, winning, of course, the Museum of Modern Art's 1940 Organic Design and Home Furnishings competition, its production was hindered by, for a lot of reasons, one of which was the start of the war. Intenza and Saarinen would later collaborate on Case Study House number 9 for John Intenza, but never again on furniture. Charles had visited Los Angeles during this time and was captivated, and Ray was from Sacramento, so it wasn't surprising when they moved there soon afterwards in 1941. I believe they met Intenza while still in Michigan, probably through the MoMA connection. If anybody has an answer to that, I'd love to hear it. And he was one of their first friends, along with McCoy once in LA. He actually got them their first apartment, which is a Neutra apartment on the west side of the city. During the 1940s, the Eames were constant contributors to Arts and Architecture magazine, introducing ideas, writing articles, and Ray specifically designing the magazine's avant-garde covers. Charles and Ray even started a business partnership with Intenza himself. Ray and Charles with Intenza here. You know, the famous molded plywood splints, of course. This was a business partnership with Intenza. They established the Ply-Formed Wood company together, which developed the plywood splints and the airplane components during the war, and then started moving into furniture after the war. Eschewing any potential conflict of interest, Intenza ran advertisements like this one promoting their plywood furniture in Arts and Architecture magazine throughout the late 1940s. During that time, Charles maintained communication with Elliot Noyes, which was a smart thing to do. He was director of industrial design at the Museum of Modern Art in New York and was instrumental in Eames and Saarinen winning the organic design competition while they were students at Cranbrook. And this is Charles and Ray's letter, Christmas letter to Elliot. Remember in your office, we were talking about possible compound curve wood splints. Well, Ray and I have developed this process and idea and are starting to make them for the Navy. They're good looking in a way. We'll send you plans sometime. Best of 1943 to you both, Charlie and Ray. In 1946, Charles was not coincidentally tapped for a one-man furniture show at MoMA. And this was, of course, before Ray had garnered any real attention for her work on the furniture as well. So the show was about Charles Eames and his new furniture. Noyes, who was still director of industrial design at the museum, published an article that same year in Arts and Architecture magazine, gushing over the furniture. There is no need to qualify the statement, Noyes writes. Charles Eames has designed and produced the most important group of furniture ever developed in this country. He has not only produced the finest chairs of modern design, but through borrowing, improvising, and inventing techniques, he has for the first time exploited the possibilities of mass production methods for the manufacture of furniture. With one stroke, he has underlined the design decadence and technical obsolescence of Grand Rapids. From all the way in California, the Eameses had brought into focus a generational shift in design filtered through the Michigan example. Grand Rapids' traditional furniture industry becoming overshadowed by Zealand's innovative Herman Miller, and New York was paying attention. Evans Products Company from the Detroit area, or possibly out of Grand Haven, Michigan. Brian and I were trying to figure this out while on the tour yesterday. Where was this actually being produced? They were doing the plywood designs. But in 1947 is when, just a year after the exhibition, Herman Miller gains exclusive market and distribution rights. And this is at the behest of George Nelson, of course, who was the newly appointed director for design of that company. By 1948, Ray Eames began designing magazine ads and showroom displays for Herman Miller in Michigan and in Los Angeles, among other cities across the country. The Eameses may have moved to California, but their relationship with Michigan was thriving. The Eameses practice introduces what might be considered another key way to consider the Michigan-California influence. For me, the connection with Michigan has only partially to do with who was born and educated there, and much to do with a regional culture of mass manufacturing and distribution that lay at the base of modern sensibilities and influenced an entire approach to design, much of which we've been hearing about during the last few days. Michigan's automobile industry is foundational here. Quoting from my California colleague, Alan Hess, again from his article, Michigan Modernism, as the auto industry quickly took its central role in the American economy, its wealth and power generated new research, new possibilities, and new excitement. While Michigan designers were conversant with modern ideas developed elsewhere, designers from elsewhere were often attracted to the state by the modern culture already underway there. The Eameses were undoubtedly influenced by this culture while at Cranbrook, and were thus primed to identify a similar energy in Los Angeles during the war. California became the center of the aviation and shipbuilding industry, bringing attention to the idea that prefabricated building parts might be rolled off the line during peacetime, much like airplane parts had for the military. The Eameses moved to Los Angeles from the Bloomfield Hills, Detroit area shortly before the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and so they were really witness to the city's incredible growth in both manufacturers and workers coming to California at the time. Their work designing molded plywood aircraft parts for the aviation industry gave them firsthand experience with prefabricated methods and actually provided them access to rationed materials, which a lot of other architects and designers couldn't get a hold of at the time. And it gave them sort of a jump ahead. And on this side here, you see Charles, Ray, Bertoya, and Gregory Ain, three who had come from via Michigan. Gregory Ain not, but Gregory Ain actually I think was, I was talking with a colleague yesterday and he said Gregory Ain was probably the engineer for a lot of these pieces at the time, even though Charles's name is always stamped on them. He was serving as engineer in the office at the time. The formal character of the designs being produced, I think, was important an inspiration as the materials and the manufacturing processes. As Charles stated in an article for California Arts and Architecture, before it became just Arts and Architecture, shortly after arriving in Los Angeles, in the airplane, one feels strongly the appropriateness of its streamed lines, and they seem healthy and good. The Eameses felt similarly about the automobile, although they were dubious about its post-war incarnation. And I have to thank Donald Albrecht, going back through a book on the Eameses. He begins his chapter with that hilarious and telling story about the Eameses buying a car after the war. They had owned Ford convertibles, he talks about, since 1941, the year they married and moved to Los Angeles. But buying a car in 1954, Donald Albrecht says, was difficult for them. They apparently found the industry's new two-toned models garish. Charles wrote to Henry Ford II personally, thanking him for the company's great work, but asking if he could make a simple black model for them with natural top, tan interior, and minimum of advertising logos. And I'd love to see if you had a picture of Charles and Ray in a car. It would be a good find. In fact, a review of Arts and Architecture reveals frequent inspirations from both auto and aviation industries, albeit in different ways. In his comments on the magazine's 1943 Designs for Post-War Living competition, Sumner Spalding looked to his native Michigan as much as his adopted California. The evolution of the airplane, resulting in such diversified examples as the helicopter and the flying wing, he said, have has produced forms compatible with the actual function of flying with human or freight cargo. Prejudice concerning appearance has never been tolerated in the airplane industry. The automobile, on the other hand, has never completely abandoned the pattern of the horse-drawn vehicle. It has been able to concede to certain prejudices without too much loss of life. At other times, the Eameses found reason to celebrate the car's ability to bend to personal taste. For example, Buckminster Fuller's What is a House in Arts and Architecture, featuring these wonderful dynamic montages by the Eameses and Herbert Matter, suggests that much like the criteria guiding the case study house program as laid out by Intenza, prefabrication must not be used to create a one-size-fits-all product, and the car is used as an example. The house would be an extension of this, and it would offer even more to a greater degree than the car, opportunities for the occupants to individualize their environment. This is an example of all the number of cars that would be different from each other once they multiplied and multiplied. The Eames house, or case study house number 8, is an example of both prefabrication and also personalization while responding to the natural ecology of the site. In this way, it fit neatly into McCoy's criteria for California's modern architecture. In her book on the case study houses, McCoy emphasizes this case study was never intended as a prototype for similar houses. The plan, Charles always said, was personal, and McCoy agreed. It was the Eameses' furnishings, their collections of objects, and the projects being developed in the adjacent home studio that animate the project. For a new generation, it was this content with which they filled the Spartan framework, what McCoy eloquently described as the collection of objects, small and beautiful, fine and folk, that proved inspirational. The Eames, Robert Venturi later claimed, reinvented good Victorian clutter. The Eames house was also a great hangout spot. And McCoy, who was a lifelong friend, she's pictured here on the side with the gray hair in her later years, and Ray, of course, you can't miss. McCoy was a lifelong friend and was a frequent visitor. So too, it must be remembered, was everybody else. The house, as well as their office in Venice, California, became a mecca for design thinkers attracted to California by articles in Arts and Architecture and by McCoy. And not only Rayner Banham, who architects love to focus on, but lots of other people as well, including here Elliot Noyes. The house was personal to her, and it appears in the touching obituaries she later wrote first for Charles and finally for Ray. McCoy's collection of photographs of the Eames house in her personal archive is, for me, however, particularly telling. Charles took many of these images, his name scrawled on the back, and their beauty expresses the importance of the dialogue between house and site that I pay particular attention to as someone who studies McCoy, and that I experienced myself, actually, when visiting the site. Outside, standing on the wild meadow, overlooking the Pacific, visitors are enveloped by the smell of eucalyptus or the fog rolling in from the nearby coastline. Charles's use of black and white is a deliberate exercise in expressing the primacy of reflection and the blurred distinctions between house and the site over that sort of Mondrian-esque exterior and the colorful collection stored inside. In this interpretation, the house is a canonical melding of McCoy's historical criteria for Southern California modernism, the prefabricated steel frame in the garden. There were two key outcomes of the case study house program, according to McCoy. One, for the first time through the magazine, LA had a cultural focus, and in this climate, good designers in fields allied to architecture flourished. Second, it gave encouragement to architects in Europe, Japan, and Latin America. Hence, the program helped establish what we associate with Southern California modern residential design, and then exported that approach across the globe. Practitioners from all over took note. And some would take to its sunny shores, and some wouldn't. Ironically, for Intenza, the very projects he strove to support, he never felt fully comfortable in, and he headed back to the Midwest in the early 1960s. I love this hilarious caricature of Intenza by McCoy, who knew him very well. She knew him from his early 20s until his death. From 1950 on, when I wrote fairly regularly for the magazine, she stated, I would take my story and photographs to John's case study house, and we would sit at the end of the kitchen. It might have been apparent to him that he was not a case study himself, for he sold the house and moved into a Neutra apartment in Westwood. In 1962, when he finally sold arts and architecture to David Travers and moved to Chicago to head the Graham Foundation, he moved into a Mies apartment, whereupon my 2 trips to Chicago, we drank coffee close to the kitchen, our backs to the glass wall. Still, she also notes that by 1962, the Eameses and other architects featured in arts and architecture had fixed Los Angeles indelibly on the design elite map. They also inspired new generations to move to LA, many of them attracted to the characteristics McCoy had established in her writings on the area, but also, as with the Eames before them, still maintaining bridges to influential places and experiences outside of the state. This included Caesar Pelli, who had been working in Eero Saarinen's office in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, and New Haven, Connecticut. Once in LA, he struck up a close friendship with McCoy, and later wrote this telling tribute to Southern California in the introduction to her book, The Second Generation. Most of the architects who left a mark in Southern California went there from somewhere else. We all went there, attracted by opportunity and some images. The images included some physical qualities such as the sky, the light, and the landscape of Southern California. But most of all, we were attracted by the great promise to make a new city. All these combined images are important and have an effect on the architecture of Southern California. So too, I believe, did the influence of Michigan have an effect on the architecture of LA, as a place where many West Coast practitioners were born, educated, and enculturated in the ethos of modern design and mass production. Thus, at the same time that I'm interested in unearthing the story of how McCoy helped establish our historical reading of architectural practice in LA, I think it's equally important to make the ties practitioners had outside of the state part of that story. So I'm interested in sort of unpacking her mythology a little bit. As more connections between Michigan and California are unearthed, the richer this history will become. Thank you. Time for a couple questions? Okay. Yes. They didn't do more architecture. I think Charles did that one house, but after, he was trained as an architect. And after that point, they really did start focusing on all of these other things, which I do think, that sort of interest in universal design now that has sort of come back into popularity is an example through them. Ray, the research on her in the last, 10, maybe more years has really started to come out a little bit more. And you see her hand in these designs, especially, I think really her connection with Intenza was the strongest, first of all. She was designing for him while Charles was out doing sets and things for MGM, and she was working with Intenza on arts and architecture first. Yeah.
Could you tell us a little more about the relationship between Schulman and Intenza? You said they fought a lot.
Yeah, you have very strong personalities here. I know Intenza and Charles eventually fell out of favor, I think, over a lawsuit concerning that ply-formed wood company. Esther McCoy was never one to hold her tongue, and has anyone here met Julius Schulman? It pretty much speaks for itself. I spent a lot of time with him when I was in graduate school studying Esther McCoy, and then later, of course, in connection to the Julius Schulman Institute. The stories are kind of hard. I don't have an exact answer for you why Intenza, not from Julius' side, but from Intenza's side. And again, I throw it out to the audience if anybody knows more about Intenza. I feel like I'm sort of picking that out of archives here and there about his relationship with other people. I know Julius had told me that he was very annoyed with Intenza, and somebody else I was talking to this week re-emphasized that he didn't want to publish the kinds of very lifestyle-oriented photographs that Julius Schulman was having fun doing. And by the way, carrying an Eames chair, or his assistant carrying an Eames chair around on his back from shoot to shoot to shoot. So it didn't matter what furniture the people had in their homes, it was going to have an Eames chair, and that one traveled. You could probably, I haven't done this, put his photographs together and see the same chair. So I think, I mean, he continued to do photographs for the magazine. Primarily, I think, being pulled in by the people who were writing the articles. So McCoy would get a job through the LA Times, through Intenza or whatever else, and she would bring Julius on board to shoot the images. I mentioned earlier, too, and I know we've had the talk on Korab this week. I think it's really important for us to keep talking about the photographers. Marvin Rand was also someone that she had worked with, and we know very little about his work. The family archive is around. I've had a lot of fun looking at that. But he came on with McCoy in the early 1960s and started photographing a lot of LA where Schulman left off, and also very strong and difficult personality. Some fun there. I don't think it's ever really ended. I think we're just at the beginning of talking about those connections, and as we keep talking about it, they'll keep coming out. And that's kind of why it's not as contemporary, but I ended with Cesar Pelli, because he sort of signals this next generation of designers coming through, you know, perhaps the Saarinen office, perhaps something else, coming out to California and hooking up with people like McCoy, who at that point, you know, is in her 70s and then her 80s, and becoming friends with her and sort of getting folded into that California historicizing. Yeah, sure. When Julius was alive, he knew that he wanted his collection to go to the Getty, and so that was bequeathed to them before he died. And he was very focused on self-promotion and making sure that his legacy was taken care of the last 25 years of his life, I would say, unlike a lot of other architectural photographers. And I think that's one reason why we know him so well, is he was really, really focused on that. Also, he wasn't so thrilled about what was going on in LA at the time in terms of architecture. I mean, I think he got dragged kicking and screaming to some Frank Gehry sites, and eventually kind of warmed up, probably by Esther McCoy. And then everything else was horrible, horrible, you know. Why photograph this horrible architecture? So he focused on that. I think it's one of his later wives who was a student at Woodbury, and he was never really formally trained and very touched or driven by the idea of educating young people. So he wanted to found sort of an educational center at Woodbury University, which he did at the time, working with somebody in sort of our promotions department. And when he was alive, they would go around to high schools and talk about, you know, have a passion for something. I don't care if it's photography. I discovered photography in high school. You discover whatever you want. Just discover something. And that's basically what he did at the time. And then we had a lot of conversations while he was alive. Once he passed and they put me in the directorship position, you know, we don't have an archive, we don't have a store of things to lend or to study, although we do have partnerships with the Getty. It really became more focused on sort of unearthing photography of the built environment. And I say built environment because as we're trying to develop it, we're developing it very broadly in that sense. So on the one hand, bringing attention to all of these architectural photographers that were doing amazing and incredible work and really letting us know what the architecture was. I mean, how often do we see the buildings? We know the buildings through the photograph. So doing that, and then the other hand, looking at people who are quote unquote in the art world and their work on the built environment. So we sort of have a foot in both places. Yeah. Yeah.
Does Ezra Stoller play any role in the California story?
I don't know. My knee-jerk reaction is to say not so much. But somebody might tell me otherwise. I don't think so. I think he stayed focused here, and then if anywhere, East Coast, and then, you know, some other places. Yeah, I think California really, Julius Schulman had a bit of a stronghold, first of all. And I could be wrong, but I think people still weren't really focused on California. It was still kind of developing at the time, and the promotion was still getting out there.